Start telling stories. And I mean that truly. Start telling stories. We cannot lose the art of storytelling. And this is something that I'm actually getting excited as I think about it. We're so excited about AI's ability to tell our stories, write our research papers, even author books for us, and we don't have to do anything about it. But I think if we lose that quality of storytelling, that is probably the last hurrah before we're no longer human.
Why should we tell more stories? Aren't we all indigenous? What does it mean to be a wisdom keeper? Wakanyi Hoffman is the best person to ask all of that. She's a wisdom keeper of indigenous knowledge, an author and a keynote speaker specialized in Ubuntu philosophy. Wakanyi just concluded a research fellowship at the New Institute in Hamburg and will soon be joining the Institute of Cultural Inquiry at Utrecht University as part of a newly launched inclusive AI lab where she will be adding voices of indigenous wisdom to AI. Hello, Wakanyi. Welcome to this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You are a scholar of indigenous knowledge. What do you mean when you talk about indigenous wisdom and indigenous knowledge? And a second question that I think goes hand in hand is, what distinguishes how we see wisdom to the way that indigenous people see wisdom?
What a beautiful question to begin our conversation. Thank you so much. Before I came to this podcast, I was actually listening to a song by one person that I listen to often. Her name is Holly Near, and she very much talks about listening to indigenous women or listening to First Nations, the voices of First Nations and children and old women. And I think that gives me the answer that I was looking for this particular question, is that indigenous wisdom is really the voices of the ancient communities, which we would say today First Nations. And First Nations carry with them if you want to get esoteric, the sound of the land, right? They have interacted with the earth for thousands of years, that they are in flow in terms of stories that have been passed down for generations that speak about this human adventure on this planet. So the original adventure, the interaction, the sort of point of contact, these stories live with so-called First Nations. And so indigenous wisdom is that voice of that land and human beings connected by stories that have been shared over time, which then obviously you will find mostly with indigenous communities and children. So I'd go even as far as to say indigenous wisdom is also the voice of children, because children also come fresh with no preconceived ideas and stories. So if you watch children and you think about how children interact, if a child is left alone to interact with natural systems, they will tap into that same indigenous wisdom. And so these stories are what the rest of society is built on. So indigenous wisdom or indigenous stories that are passed down as wisdom tales are also what the rest of us, modern society, is made up of. Now, you ask the difference between how we see wisdom and how indigenous people see wisdom. So I guess this is a contrast between modern world, modern society, and indigenous people. I would say the key difference is that indigenous populations or indigenous communities see the world as one ecosystem, okay? One unit. And therefore, an indigenous person cannot distinguish themselves from the rest of the ecosystem, meaning that I am part of the ecosystem. I don't have more rights than a fish, for example. If I was to think of, sort of the indigenous communities, First Nations in America, that have a very special interaction with salmon, for example, in California, down by Mount Shasta. This community sees itself, the people and the salmon, they're salmon keepers, for example. And then you might have the eagle keepers. You might have in Africa, the lion keepers, so there is this interaction with other non-living life that is at equality, because as an indigenous person, you are part of the ecosystem. So whether it's a tree or an animal or a lake or a river, they're all parts of the whole. And that to me would be the difference between modern populations where we see there's a very human-centric life. We built our cities in the middle of the land, so we are important, right? And we had to cut down trees, for example, to create space for ourselves. Whereas for indigenous communities, even living in the natural land requires living with, right? So you build around things. You don't interrupt the flow of the natural landscape, for example. So I think this is the main difference.
While I was listening to you, I was thinking the modern world understands that we are interconnected, but the indigenous people know that we are interracial. You know, like everyone is in a relation with everyone. So it's not just I'm connected to you, but we are in a relation, and we are also in a relation to nature. I don't know if this is something you would agree to.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you think about it, systems that have created the modern world look very much like systems that one would think are indigenous. You know, this idea of interconnectedness. Systems are interconnected. The political world is connected to the financial world. It's connected to citizens and so on and so forth, the education system and all of that. But it is the intention, right? And I like that you say interrelational versus interconnectedness. I think, yes, everything is interconnected, but from an indigenous perspective, there is that continuous repair of relationships between human and non-human entities. And I think that's what makes a significant difference, is that your life, you as an indigenous person, you recognize that you are in continuous and perpetual relationship with animals, with other human beings, with the planet. And then as a community of life, to use sort of a very UN language, you know, this Hague principle, the community of life, which is made up of human, non-human, and all the other entities in the ecosystem, then what is that relationship as the planet with the entire universe? And that is relational. So we understand, of course, modern science teaches us, you know, the planets are in the same solar system and all of that. So we understand interconnectedness. But being in continuous relationship with everything else is what keeps that interconnectedness intact. And that's what indigenous people are really good at, that they understand. They have a very strong understanding of this because, again, they hold the wisdom of the past, right? Ancient wisdom, that first point of contact between human beings and the rest of the world.
When I first encountered the word indigenous, I was thinking about the Maori in New Zealand or the Aborigines in Australia. But now you mentioned that every child has this indigenous part in him or herself. So I'm wondering, am I also indigenous or am I native? Are we all not just indigenous? And where does it stop?
So this is a really interesting question, and I think it can be contrived. And to say that we're all indigenous to this planet could almost flatten the indigenous experience. So the way that I like to think about it is that, for example, a child born anywhere on the planet could be raised anywhere. Think about it, you know, if you give birth to a child in Austria or here in the Netherlands where I am, or in Kenya, and that child was raised within the Maori community, for example, or that child was raised within a community in Africa, let's say, for example, the San community in the Kalahari, the child doesn't have another way of being, doesn't have an understanding of another way of being. So they will be like those who have raised them, right? So they'll be indigenous. In many ways, they'll grow up as if they were an indigenous person. Indigenous means your proximity to this knowledge that we're talking about, this indigenous wisdom. And the process of colonizing ourselves has actually distanced ourselves from indigenous identity. So those who have remained for thousands of years in a particular landscape are the most authentic, if one would say, authentic indigeneity, right? Of course, we're all indigenous to this planet, but our proximity to these values of indigenous thinking, of indigenous living, is what distinguishes modern indigenous people versus really true indigeneity, right? And if you think about it, so for example, Native Americans have had probably around 300 to 400 years of colonial history, right? So that means that on their DNA, on their skin, there's layers of colonization that's taken them away from those original values. But they've done an amazing job of reconstituting or repairing or remembering, right? Despite the horrific tales of being removed from their land and being put in boarding schools and being basically forced to forget who they are. Africa suffers the same, right? It's only about 100 years old in terms of the colonial history. However, that colonial history was so brutal that it meant forgetting ways of being, forgetting even how to speak certain languages. And then look at Europe, for example. How far removed is one from their ancestral knowledge? So this distance, if you think about it, is almost like the distance between the sun and different planets, right? So we're circling this indigenous thinking and indigenous ways of being, of belonging. But your distance away from the sun within that solar system is what gives you that closeness to indigeneity. So yes, we're all indigenous, but how far removed are you from the indigenous values that actually authenticate that indigeneity?
And do you have any recommendations how I can rewild myself, you know?
Well, I think, first of all, just on a very basic level, I think anytime anybody goes camping, that desire to go camping, just to sit in a tent, or even like natural camping, where you're camping without a tent. And I'll give you an example. I'm a mommy of 4 kids. And one of my daughters is very inspired by the outdoors. She loves to be outside more than she loves to be inside the house. In fact, we sometimes think she would benefit from just having a little hut outside the house and then often come home to eat and then go back outside. She did something interesting for her birthday. She invited 2 of her friends and they slept outside. They actually slept outside on the grass in our garden. Now, we have a bit of an overgrown garden. Even though I live in Europe, I still bring my wilded African girl with me. And I wasn't at home. So I asked the question, did you sleep in a tent or how did it go? And she said, no, we just took our sleeping bags and slept outside in nature, right? So mosquitoes, snails, everything, she was immersed in that. And I think there's something within all of us that finds that more natural, right? The desire to go and be camping, whether it's glamping or camping, the desire to be outside of the confines of modernity and in the natural landscape where you're in touch with the natural elements, that is our first instinct, that we're not far removed from this wilded indigenous thinking that I'm talking about. And so I think just camping, that alone will activate your wilded child in you.
Then I would say I'm on a good path of rewilding myself.
Well done, you.
I met you 1.5 years ago, and really you sparked something in me, Wakanyi, because you said that the stories we are telling each other today shape our future. So words become reality. And since that, this phrase is really literally on my mind every day. So you're a storyteller and you're well aware of the power that stories have. What do you think is the key to good storytelling, not just to educate the minds of the people, but also bring in heart education?
Well, first of all, what is a story? A story is a collection of experiences, right? If you think about it in that way, we are each capable, or we are all actually experiencing life all the time, right? Whether we're consciously aware of what we're in relationship with or who we're in relationship with, we are perpetually experiencing this thing called life, this thing called being human. So that in itself is a story, and it's unique to everyone. If you think about it, we might go camping and look at the sky, but what the constellations in the sky that I see are very different to what you see, because there's an inner dialogue within you. And I think that inner dialogue to me is the truth of the universe that either you're resonating with or you're resisting, right? And so a good story is the one that gives us the ability to tap into that which is true of all life, that if a bird could speak, could have the same experience. If a tree could speak, it would have the same experience. And then there is resonance. So to me, when a story doesn't resonate with me, I feel that there's something within me that I'm resisting, or there's something within the storyteller that they were resisting, right? And it requires it's an art of stillness. It's an art of being truly still enough, long enough to understand what that is within you that's resonating or resisting with that story. Doesn't sound true, or it sounds too good to be true. And then how you're interpreting it in the head. We talk a lot about now, in fact, we're at an age where, and I just came from the European Forum Alpac, there's a lot of heart talk. People saying, we need to get back to the heart, we need to get to the inner world. And that's incredibly exciting to be in that space where we are talking about heart intelligence in a very business head oriented, intellectually stimulating space. But I think rather than saying we need to move from the head to the heart, I think it's some kind of integration. And that's true storytelling to me. It's this integration of what does my heart say and how am I interpreting it in my head? Because the head is where all the information has been gathered, right? Outside of yourself. You've gathered this information there. If you've traveled, you've gathered lots of information from different cultures. You've heard things, whether they're true or not, they're all stored in you, right? But your heart is what is generating that internal dialogue. So to me, a true story is when the head speaks the language of the heart. To me, I think that's when you have resonance. And that requires a lot of stillness. And of course, we live in a world where stillness is really difficult to generate, right? We're busy, we have many things to do. But stillness is something, it's a quality of the universe. It's something that we have. We require to be still in order to understand where we're moving, in order to understand, to be aware of what is around you. So when you are in that true stillness, I think that's when the truth of the universe bubbles in you. And then you can be able to interpret what you're hearing, whether it resonates or not, whether it's true or not. And perhaps that's what we also sometimes call intuition. But I think it's something beyond intuition. It is a receiving of something that is perhaps greater than yourself, that deeper truth.
I just love what you said, because it reminded me of, if there is a storyteller, there also have to be listeners, and being still is a form of, it's an ability to actually go into resonance. Like, I just thought of how many times I also went in resistance when I heard stories, and how much this showed me about myself. For me, this is also a good story where you can make an individual threat to yourself and see how this can actually bring you further, or if there's a message for you inside.
Right. And if you think about it, I love that you talk about story in that way, as a thread that you're connecting somehow, things that you know and things that you might not know. A good storyteller, at least from an African perspective, there's usually this quote that I love to quote my dear friend Zain Varji, who's a former CNN anchor, but also she picked that up from somewhere in Africa, that the most important person in the room is the storyteller. But that doesn't mean that there's only one storyteller. It's a question of who is telling the story. There's not just one storyteller, but the most important person in the room is the storyteller. So in order to really have resonance, you have to tell a story that feels and connects that thread of human values from one to the next, right? So that becomes the most important thing. And usually the best stories are those that are co-created. So if you look at storytelling from an indigenous African perspective, the storyteller actually tells stories and poses questions in the stories. There's a way in which it's an art, it's a weaving. So the audience participates in responding based on how well that story resonates with them. And if it doesn't, then the storyteller must listen to what wants to be told, what needs to emerge. And someone else from the audience might actually add a new dimension, a new element to the story, and it becomes a whole brand new story, right? This is the art of oral storytelling, where there is no, you don't put threads at the end of the story. You don't lock it, you don't say, and that's the end of the story. It really doesn't end. It is a continuum, right? Because that is the experience of being human. We are here to discover who we are to infinity. There is no beginning, nor any end.
In your research about African folk tales, do they also have something that we have in Europe a lot, like the moral of the story, that we put it in the end? Is this also very common?
Absolutely. And in fact, a good folk tale always begins, it could begin with the moral of the story, but it's not given away, right? So maybe this would be the difference, where at the end of a story, let's say a story about Cinderella, you see very clearly what the moral of the story was. Whereas from an African perspective, a folktale should not give you a direct answer. It should provide multiple pathways. And this is very indigenous thinking. What is the path towards a mountain? I shouldn't tell you, Katerina, take this map and you'll get to the top of the mountain and you see this particular tree, and that will be the mark of the top of the mountain. The top of the mountain could be absolutely anywhere. It truly depends on the journey that you are willing to take, right? So multiple pathways. So at the end of a good story, there are multiple possibilities. And that's why these stories are timeless. Tales from Africa are timeless. They are wisdom keeping in a way that the wisdom of the past is still relevant today. But the story changes. The characters might change. The scenery might change. But the elements, the moral of the story gets more and more refined depending on what the next generation of storytellers is trying to go through or trying to understand about being human on this planet.
I know that your grandfather was a very, very special person for you. So can you share with us why he was so important to you while you were growing up in Kenya?
Thank you for bringing the spirit of my grandfather into this podcast. How lovely. So my grandfather, this is my mother's father, so my maternal grandfather. I didn't get to interact much with him. He passed away when I was only 2 years old. However, there's something about his life that resonates and has remained resonant within not just me, within all of us children of that particular family. My grandfather was a man of two worlds. So he was a culture diplomat in many ways. So he was half Maasai and half Kikuyu, two very different tribes with very different cultures and live in very different parts of the country in Kenya. And he maintained this space of being both quite well. And in a way, he maintained it so that he could create his own culture. In many ways, he married the Kikuyu and the Maasai culture, and he became this hybrid of a person. So he could be in both worlds. And as the story goes, with every child that's born, so he was raised in the Kikuyu community. His mother was Maasai, who had been married within the community. So he should have grown up very much like a Kikuyu elder, which he was in many ways, but he maintained this Maasai way of being as well. And so within the Kikuyu community, when a child is born, you're supposed to do some certain rituals, or at least slaughter a goat and have a party for the newborn, right? Just like any other culture, you celebrate the birth of a new baby. But in Kikuyu culture, for a baby boy, a bit gender-ist here, a baby boy is you slaughter two goats. So there's more prominence is given. I know more prominence is given to boys than girls, or at least that was how it was culturally back then. Maybe things have changed quite a little bit now. But when I was born, he did exactly that. He slaughtered two goats for me, this baby girl, the last of my mother's children. And he had this way of explaining why he's going against culture. And according to my mom, he felt very strongly that I would be able to hold this kind of prominence, I guess is a word, I don't know, or is it I would be able to hold, I guess maybe in a way he was looking for some kind of wisdom keeper within the family. Maybe that's what it was, right? And so for him to have slaughtered two goats was very unusual. And for him to have insisted upon having a big party around this one child was also quite unusual. But again, he was known for doing things differently. So that was one of the things that he did. And then another thing that makes him really important in my life was that during that time when he was raising his own children, he had three daughters and three sons. And what he did was, at the time, you were not supposed to send your girls to school. So nobody used to send girls to school. Only boys would go to school. Again, another thing that has been fought. Of course, that's not the case now. But he decided to send all his children to school, both girls and boys. And there was a big hula baloo. People come to his house asking, how could you, start a new trend? And now this is going to spoil our girls, because the running narrative was that if you took the girls to school, they'd become too clever, and therefore too clever for the men to marry, right? So girls used to be married off to much older men. And he allowed all these stories to go on, and all these accusations and all of that. And in the end, what he said, I don't have much to say, but I need you to understand something about me. In my house, I don't have boys and girls. I have children. And I made the decision to send all my children to school. So my grandfather is really the reason why I am where I sit today. If he hadn't made this decision, right, to send all his children to school, meaning girls and boys, my mom would have been married off to some old man in the village, and I probably wouldn't have been born as I was born, or I would have been born, somewhere else and not gotten the opportunities that I've had to be able to sit here and have a conversation with you. So even when he died, at his funeral, he was hailed as a girls' educator, as a champion of girls' education. And it's interesting to see such a traditional man seeing this future and understanding that there's another way of raising girls. There's another way of seeing children as equals. And I don't have to go and shout about it. I don't have to go and make a lot of noise about it. But I can create little changes, in a very gentle way. I can change, I can shake up the culture. And he could do it because he was sitting in this hybrid position. So he could escape the classic, you are this, you're supposed to be this accusation, and he could become anything he wanted to be, because he was holding this tension of two worlds very beautifully within himself. So to me, I credit him for everything that I am and that I've become. And I strongly feel his presence around me.
So your grandfather already saw your purpose, your wisdom keeping purpose in you. And I was wondering how much it influenced you in raising your 4 children.
So like I was saying, I did not really see myself as a wisdom keeper, nor did I think of it as anything that one did, right? That was also quite the thing that old people did. However, I think something happens. I don't know if this is scientifically proven, if we can find facts for it, but I think once you have a child, once you become a mother, once you birth, that's a very special, sacred experience. And I think this is what exactly happened to me. As soon as I had my first baby, I had this clarity that I wanted to raise my children in the best natural way possible. So I began very unconsciously having sort of challenging the status quo, challenging the world in which my child was growing up in. And the most interesting thing that happened, and I still talk about it now, is that I began to see how time, the concept of time, or modern time, modern clock, is really hedged against modern parenting, right? So we parent our kids in this space of 9 to 5, and everything has to fit within that time. But children have no concept of time. And so to me, when it comes to wisdom keeping, I started to realize that children are tapped. They've tapped into, or they are in tune with indigenous thinking, indigenous time, as I call it, right? And if children are naturally wired to think in indigenous time, then the modern world doesn't work at all. And so maybe this is where the indigenous wisdom began to get activated within me is by observing. And I was a stay-at-home mom on purpose. I decided to stay at home with all my 4 kids. And I know that I existed in a different time. Everybody else is going to work 8 to 5, but my time was in tune with the children's time, which is very non-linear. We might have lunch for breakfast. We might have breakfast for lunch. We might sleep at 10 p.m. and wake up at 2 a.m. We might sleep in until 6, until 10 in the morning. We might wake up several times. So children don't have a concept of this modern clock that we have. And so to me, then this activated the idea of, is there another way? Is there another way of being in this world that children are in tune to, but the rest of us have tapped into a different clock? And so when constant contrast, when constant tension, and this is exactly what's going on. If you look at mothers or motherhood today, a lot of people don't even want to go that direction, because it's very difficult to raise children in this modern society where you have to fit your child into your work schedule, right? And babies don't have a schedule. They don't even have a due date, right? So we've engineered this entire thing, being mothers, being parents, and it's been co-opted into a system that's not natural. And so I think that motherhood activated this wisdom keeping. And therefore my sense of purpose began then, realizing that I had a role to play to direct children in a particular way. I had a role to play to bring up children in a way that is most natural and that most works with their natural rhythm and not against. And so I have walked a very different path, which isn't the 9 to 5, which isn't linear, which isn't one task or one job. I wear many hats, and this is all part of that activated understanding of indigenous thinking and indigenous time through becoming a mother.
I just love when you say that your children reactivated it, because when you started talking, I was thinking, so are your children your teachers? But this is hierarchical, no? And I was like, this word reactivation is such a beautiful word. And I know that you're working in a project of service space where you combine heart intelligence and AI. And I was wondering while you're talking, like, is this the aim of the project, to also reactivate our indigenous thinking? And maybe you can share what the project is and answer the question of, is there a way of reactivate this indigenous thinking in us when we use what you're creating there?
That is a beautiful thing to ask. Well, first of all, I want to say that I don't envision while working, and I'll explain what I'm doing with service-based AI and all of that. But when it comes to technology, the vision isn't to have AI that functions as human beings, right? We don't want artificial intelligence to become even more than human, like really good human beings, right? We want it to work for us. We want to be in co-creation. So this is a tension that I'm holding even as I work in this space, where I'm wondering, to what extent do we want machines to become more like us? And do we even want them to become like us, right? So with ServiceSpace is an organization run by Nipun Mehta, who's a common friend. And ServiceSpace has been collecting data or stories or information from different faith traditions and teachings, spiritual teachings and different traditions around the world, including indigenous traditions. And what it's done, it's a curation of wisdom, right? So ServiceSpace is like your modern indigenous wisdom keeper, or modern wisdom keeper, right? If you want, maybe not indigenous, but just modernity's wisdom. And what has been generated out of ServiceSpace is this concept of compassion as something that cuts across all cultures, all religions, all communities, whether you're living in a very modern community in New York City, for example, or you're living out on indigenous land like the Kalahari Desert. Compassion becomes the thing that as human beings we share in common. So ServiceSpace is in the art of weaving compassion into the fabric of AI. And that's where I come in. So I'm working with ServiceSpace from the perspective of an indigenous wisdom keeper and looking at, how does compassion look from an Indigenous perspective. It's very non-commercial. It's not a thing that you have to work towards. It's an activated way of being, right? Compassion is who we are. We're compassionate beings. And from an Indigenous perspective, this idea of interconnectedness or interrelational, the universe, that is the organizing principle of the universe, is compassion. And compassion can be ambiguous. It's a big word. What does compassion in action look like? At the core of compassion is care. Care for yourself and care for all of life, right? So this is from an Indigenous perspective, care means that you don't commit any act of violence, whether it is with your words or with your actions, to yourself or to anything, to the extent that even the way that you eat is you have to be compassionate to yourself, to your digestive system, right? Eat in a particular way, swallow in a particular way. That is compassion, right? Now, from an Indigenous perspective, looking back as, like even in my childhood, cutting down a tree, right? You must think about the ecosystem around that tree. You must think about the birds and the worms that depend on this tree. So when you think about it like that, that is compassion in action. How do we organize communities that are compassionate? Not human-centric compassion, but compassion is a universal organizing principle. And that's what we're trying to thread into the fabric of AI with service-based AI.
Yesterday, I asked AI what question they would ask you if they would have you on a podcast.
All right.
And the question is, how has your background as a cultural diplomat and storyteller influenced your approach to promoting diverse narratives in education?
Wow. That is such a smart question. That takes pretty much all my experience in life and bottles it into education. Wow.
I was quite impressed by this question, honestly.
It is impressive. I think one of the things I would think about, well, firstly, I didn't get into traveling and living in different parts of the world as an expert on consciously. It wasn't a decision that I made consciously. It was sort of, the job came with my husband, and so we decided to move around, or we moved around with the job without truly understanding what the beginning or the end was, but it became an exciting adventure. And we finally landed in a place in our hearts where we felt like we needed to engineer this experience a little bit and have it be our way, right? And also our children were older and we were concerned about them moving too much and, changing schools. So we ended up in the Netherlands. And it's only been in the last 5 years that I've finally reflected on this cultural diplomat title that, AI is giving me. And what I've learned is that actually all cultures have the same organizing principles at the root. It's all ubuntu. It's all this concept of being human. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human amongst others, right? And one could go and say, from an Indigenous perspective, it's all community. And then the individual grows within the community. And then from a modern Western perspective, the individual is stronger and more important, and then the community comes second. That may be true, but it also depends on the context and the circumstances that one is living in. But I think at the core of cultures, there's a strong desire to belong to a community, to have this sense of, I belong with people, I belong with other life forms. Whether you are in a very individualized setting or a communal setting, you can be in a community, but you don't feel like you belong in that community, right? So this concept of being human, which in Southern Africa we say ubuntu, being human, the word actually means being human. This is a concept that is not unique to Africa. It's actually unique to humanity, that we have this desire to belong, to be seen, to be known, to be in communion. And so what I've learned from all these travels and understanding different cultures and how we organize ourselves around community or around my own individual needs is that children that are growing up from these different perspectives then come out with that aspect. Either they have a stronger sense of belonging, or a limited sense of belonging. And so, from an educator's perspective, I think if I was to respond to this question, I would even say if I could change the education system, if I could influence education, I would say, how do we organize? What values, who do we need to become as communities all around the world, whether you live in a community that is very much designed around the individual or around the community? How do we design communities of belonging? And by belonging, by the way, I don't mean just belonging to each other as humanity, but actually beyond, take it out of the human experience, the human-centric experience. How do we belong with all our relations? And this is a very indigenous Native American term, all our relations being, how do we belong with the trees in our neighborhood? How do we belong with the fish in the ocean? How do we belong with the pets in our homes? How do we belong with other communities? So that sense of belonging takes this pressure away from belonging only with human beings, because there's only so many of us, even though there's 8 billion of us. And if you were to narrow it down to those that look like you, and if you're hopping from country to country, your chances of meeting people that are exactly like you, speak like you, that's a lot of pressure. And I see a lot of people, expats in particular, doing that, where you've been removed from your home country, you've moved to another country, and you're gravitating towards only those that look like you, sound like you, speak like you. That's a very limited experience. How about if you were to think of yourself as belonging beyond the human experience, just belonging to the entire community of life? And I think that is something I would love to see incorporated into modern education system. Just help children understand that belonging isn't just to other humans, it's belonging to life, that which connects all of us.
I thank you so much for this answer that you gave, because I wanted to ask you if we live in a very competitive or co-creative world where it's about cooperation. But you already answered this, because the right question is about belonging, and not just to the human world, but to the whole world. I love this. I have 3 last questions for you, Wakanyi. The first, and I have to say, I ask everyone who's on my podcast the same question. So the end is always the same. And the first of the 3 is, what is your biggest fear?
I've never been asked this question before, so I must think about it. My biggest fear would be to not have lived truthfully. And I don't mean truth in terms of, now we are very clear about my truth and your truth, right? We distinguish these things based on one's psychological experience or traumas and all of that. And I'm speaking my truth, right? That's a different kind of truth. I'm talking about that original truth that I was saying, that the truthfulness of the universe. If I am not able to tap into that, I think that is the adventure of being human, is to truly tap into the original truth, that life force that connects everything that is alive. And yeah, I think that would be the thing that I would be most afraid of, not having lived truthfully.
Thank you. The second question is, what are you currently doing that you're not sure how it will turn out?
Well, I just started holding peace circles around the world, and they've grown like a bushfire in the Kalahari Desert. And I've held peace circles in Hamburg, Tokyo, Austria, the Netherlands, and I have no idea where that's going to go. I have no idea if other people will take it on and it becomes this movement or not, or it ends. But every peace circle is evolving into something different. New elements are brought in. Somebody gave me symbols from India, for example, to use for timekeeping. Someone gave me a peace pole to use as something that we can use to hold, as a symbol of peace. So I sense that, peace is something we're always searching for, right? We know when we're not at peace, but we take it for granted. So maybe this is something that I'm working with. I'm sensing that we being society, the entire human community has taken peace for granted for so long. And now we're living in these times what we're calling the polycrisis. But even beyond that very abstract idea of the polycrisis, there are real crises. There's a climate crisis. There are refugees that have been, people have been moved out of their homes because of the climate. So climate refugees. We have wars that we're repeatedly doing the same thing. We have genocides that are ongoing, some even unknown. We take peace for granted until we're not peaceful. We're not at peace. And so maybe that is where this is my contribution to that peacekeeping on a very small micro level, is to create circles where we can do peacemaking. And I'm incorporating very indigenous elements into it. And I love that people have taken it on and want to be a part of it. So I co-create with those that want to gather. So it's not my thing. It's all of us, creating peace. Yeah.
The last is less a question, but more something that I ask you to. I usually love to listen to podcasts and the stories that people share, but I always need something practical to do. So can you hand out one practical thing for the listeners and me, what we can do based on what we talked about?
Start telling stories. And I mean that truly. Start telling stories. We cannot lose the art of storytelling. And this is something that I'm actually getting excited as I think about it. We're so excited about AI's ability to tell our stories, write our research papers, even author books for us, and we don't have to do anything about it. But I think if we lose that quality of storytelling, that is probably the last hurrah before we're no longer human. Let's tell stories. And babies are being born without any concept of the world. So what are the stories that we want to keep? What are the stories we want to pass down? We are all wisdom keepers. Wisdom keeping is keeping those stories that connect us as humanity. We can't stop telling stories. We must amplify storytelling and less chatting. And storytelling, by the way, ironically, requires us to be very still and quiet in order to discover that what needs to be told. So in order to tell, we must reduce, less is more, but we must not stop telling stories.
Thank you so much. I feel so uplifted after talking to you. Thanks.
Me too. Thank you, Katerina.